Unit 7, Colonialism and Chocolate. The learning outcomes for this unit are: Number 1. Understand European colonization and triangular trade. Number 2. Describe the colonial empire of Spain. Number 3. Understand the economics of slavery and chocolate cultivation. And number 4. Recognize the exploitation of native workers. In our last unit, we explored how chocolate became a flavored, sugary drink of the European elite along with tea and coffee. As European elites began to flavor these drinks with sugar, this in turn drove the demand for the raw materials to support the growing industry of sugar, coffee, tea, and cacao. None of these products can be grown in Europe. All require specific tropical climatic conditions. All of this created the conditions under which Europeans colonized the rest of the world. During the 16th and 17th centuries, European countries rushed to establish overseas colonies. These colonies were a source of competition between European powers. And in that sense, Spain had a big head start, with its colonies in Mesoamerica. Colonies in North America and the Caribbean followed by other European countries. Colonies over time became sources of raw materials and resources. In order to extract those resources at a profit, labor expenses had to be kept as low as possible. Thus, the exploitation of native peoples and slaves brought from Africa to work plantations became the norm. The Spanish were the first European power to actively exploit the New World, and also the first to import chocolate. Now, as we mentioned in an earlier podcast, the Spanish weren't only fortunate that they were the first European country to reach the Americas, but they were also fortunate for the part that they encountered first. Mesoamerica and South America were some of the only places in the Americas where the natives also prized a substance dear to Europeans: gold and silver. Gold and silver flowing from the Aztecs and Inca Empire, which was a South American civilization also conquered by the Spanish after the Aztecs, made Spain the greatest power in Europe. The influx of gold and silver also had a huge impact on the overall European economy, causing widespread inflation. At one point, a single man, Charles V, who you can see there on the right, a member of the Habsburg royal family, who as a result of marriage came under control of not only Spain but also the Holy Roman Empire, which covered much of Europe, and the new Spanish colonies in the New World. All of this has led some historians to suggest that the 16th century is really the Spanish century. Here you see the expanse of the empire of Charles V. While the empire would fragment somewhat after the retirement of Charles, the Holy Roman Empire part would go to his brother Ferdinand, and the Spanish part would go to his son Philip, who became King of Spain. The Spanish portion remained immensely important and powerful, especially after the annexation of Portugal. Eventually, Spanish power would wane in the 1600s as France, Britain, and the Netherlands tipped the balance of power away from Spain. Economic competition between European states motivated colonial expansion and allowed for the creation of an economic system which was based on exploitation and strict competition. This was known as the Mercantile System. Under the Mercantile System, colonies become the source for raw materials and cash crops, while their mother country supplies their colonies with manufactured goods. Under the Mercantile System, trade between another nation's colonies is strictly prohibited. The system is a form of economic competition and war between nations. All European countries competed to have the most productive colonies and dominate European markets. As such, the mercantile system creates economic bubbles between the mother country and colony. The economic system of mercantilism is seen most clearly in triangular trade. Triangular trade was developed in conjunction with the slave trade and is named for the routes that the ships would take between colonies, Africa, and the mother country. Manufactured goods and rum first could be traded for slaves in Africa. These slaves would then in turn be brought to America to work on plantations, farming sugar, chocolate, and other cash crops. And then these cash crops would be brought to the mother country to be manufactured. The pattern repeats indefinitely. Ships are never empty. As such, the trade routes maximize efficiency, but at a terrible human cost. The plantation system was created to produce these new exotic crops such as sugar, tobacco, chocolate, and coffee, none of which could be grown in the climate of Europe. Yet the new colonial possessions of Europe, many of which were tropical, were ideally suited for this purpose. Now, initially, native people were enslaved to work on these plantations. However, natives were dying from European diseases, which of course affected the profit potential of these crops. Over time, the African slave trade replaced native people as the dominant workforce in the New World. After all, African people were from the Old World and thus immune to the Old World diseases. Most slaves were West African people who were captured and brought to slave ports to be sold. Conditions on slave ships were nothing short of horrendous, and many died. Slaves were chained to wooden shelves and stacked one over another to maximize space, as you can see in the image to your right. Yet, if one was lucky enough to survive the journey to the New World, it didn't get much better after the ship. The plantation system was almost entirely based on slave labor to produce cash crops, such as sugar, tobacco, and chocolate. Over time, most of the chocolate consumed in Europe was produced via plantation slave labor. As demand for these products increased, so did the exploitation of slaves. The exploitation and suffering would only increase until the Industrial Revolution transforms chocolate production.